Next might be ready there, the narrow gate. Thank you, next. We're going to look this Sunday at one of the most controversial and often misunderstood statements that Jesus makes on the Sermon on the Mount. And this is what he says. He says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." This is a picture of a narrow gate. This picture of a narrow gate touches on a really deep concern that a lot of thoughtful people have about religion and Christianity. And in particular, the concern statements like this have on them. You know, Christianity calls certain beliefs wrong, and it calls certain behaviors immoral. Therefore, it impinges on human freedom by telling people what they must think and how they must live. Furthermore, Christians believe they know absolute truth. Therefore, they believe people who disagree with them are wrong, and not just wrong, but condemned before God. And again, lots of people are concerned about this. The French Enlightenment thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote, "It's impossible to live at peace with those we regard as damned." And therefore, this concern goes that Christians must be intolerant to atheists or to agnostics, people of other religions, or even other kinds of Christians like Catholics versus Protestants, liberals versus conservatives, or Presbyterians versus all kinds of people, you know. Instead, it's often thought what humility requires is giving up claims of exclusive truth. Because if we affirm that nobody can claim to know what is true, then instead, I have my truth and you have your truth, but nobody really knows, and we're in no position to judge, and that will lead to tolerance and acceptance because nobody will call anybody else wrong. It's often thought that the narrow gate or the narrow way leads to a narrow mind, to unthinking, irrational, blindly compliant to authority, intolerant bigots. And of course, it is very true that many of us who call ourselves Christians are often guilty of such things and have been guilty of that in the past. And here's what's interesting. If you look really carefully and if you examine the life and the teaching of this man Jesus, you will notice what looks to our culture like a very strange paradox. On the one hand, Jesus makes statements that are outrageously, staggeringly exclusive in our eyes. He prayed one time, and this is what he said, "This is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." Jesus says, there is a God, and not just that, He is the true God. So other gods are false gods, and not just that, He is the only true God. Most famously, Jesus once said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me." Jesus did not present His teachings as optional suggestions for a better life. He claimed to know how things are. He claimed that what He said wasn't just wise, it was true. He claimed this truth mattered more than anything else in the world, and yet, this man who made claims that were staggeringly, breathtakingly exclusive, pursued relational connections with people who were breathtakingly and scandalously inclusive. He deliberately touched an untouchable leper. He allowed a known prostitute to bathe his feet with her hair. He commended a hated Roman centurion. He partied with despised tax collectors. It's like the narrower Jesus gets in his devotion to God, the more broad-minded he is in his love and reaching out to human beings. Now, his followers often missed this dynamic. Wherever I go, music follows. I realize that this particular thing I'm about to say is in an American context, but the Barna Group is an American organization that does a lot of research around faith in our day. And they found that particularly in American culture, that American culture is increasingly splintered and divided. I mean, you just got to look at the media and you just see it so prevalent in today's news. It would be interesting to know what the stats for the UK are, but most Americans indicate that they think it would be difficult to have a natural and normal conversation with minority groups who are different from them. That's one way to measure people's broad-mindedness, I guess. They say that they would find it difficult to have a natural, normal conversation with somebody in a minority group different from them, like a Muslim, like an atheist, or an evangelical, or a member of the LGBTQ community, or a Mormon, etc. The single group that has the hardest time having natural and normal conversations with minority groups is evangelical Christians, which we are a part of. In fact, and I found this kind of strange, not only do evangelicals have the hardest time having normal, natural conversations with atheists or Muslims or people of a different sexual orientation, but 28% of evangelicals in the US say that they have a hard time having normal conversations with other evangelicals. And by contrast, the longest conversation recorded in the Bible is between Jesus and a Samaritan woman. A Samaritan, 5 times married, and now shacking up with a guy who is not even her husband, woman, who no other rabbi likely would have ever gone near. In other words, when you look at Jesus and his followers today, by our own admission in research, the followers of the most inclusive man in the history of the world have become the most excluding people. Often we are quite lax in our devotion to God, but relentlessly narrow-minded in our relationships and our attitude toward people. Jesus, on the other hand, was relentlessly narrow in his devotion to God, but outrageously broad-minded in his relationships. Why is that? Why was he that way? Well, maybe he was just inconsistent, some would say. Maybe he was just a nice guy, but not really a good thinker. Or some have said maybe these claims of Jesus' authority and religious convictions got made up by Paul and the other disciples, and then got retrofitted back into the Gospels. Some people say that he was not that clear about his own identity and the exclusivity of his message. Or maybe, just maybe, the truth that Jesus taught actually explains the life that he led. Maybe the truth that he taught is not in tension with the life that he led. Maybe it explains it. Maybe the possibility of finding deep truth and offering tolerance are not mutually incompatible. Maybe they're mutually inextricable. This is a very important topic for our day, for our culture, for people who follow Jesus, who are thinking about it. You will notice, when you think about the topic of tolerance and narrowness, when you go through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does not command tolerance. He never says, "Be thou tolerant." Why is that? Well, tolerance has a kind of minimalist quality to it. It comes from the Latin word tolerantia, which means to put up with or to endure, and that's not actually what the soul craves. When Nikki and I got married, Nikki did not say, "I promise to tolerate you, Jean, from this day forward, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, and to put up with and endure you until death shall bring relief." At least I don't think so. I don't think she said that. Parents don't tuck their kids in at night and say, "Good night, honey, sweet dreams, I tolerate you so much." You know, when somebody has a birthday, we don't sing, "I tolerate you, I tolerate you, I'm stuck with your existence. What else could I do?" We don't sing that when it's somebody's birthday. Some of you are thinking, well, that could be a very useful song, right? You are not made by God to be tolerated. Okay? You are made by God to be celebrated. We all know this deeply in our souls. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus doesn't say, tolerate your enemies. He doesn't say, put up with those who persecute you, let alone people who just think differently. If you've been through this series with us these entire couple of months now, you know about this particularly because of what we've been studying. We've been studying this particular thing. He doesn't say, if you're offering your gift at an altar and you remember that your brother or your sister has something against you and you don't like them, and you don't like how they believe or act, well, tolerate them. He doesn't say that. If somebody forces you to go with them 1 mile, he doesn't say put up with it, Tolerance is a very good thing as far as it goes, but it doesn't go really far. It goes 1 mile. It doesn't go 2 miles. Tolerance is better than intolerance, but tolerance is a pretty low bar. You can tolerate somebody without loving them. But you cannot love somebody intolerantly. Jesus now, in the Sermon on the Mount, He's inviting us to live in a kingdom, a spiritual reality, the sphere of God's will, where the primary law is not tolerance, it's love. Is love. Because God is love. And so He says, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemy. Love certainly includes the virtue of tolerance. It surely will, but that leads to the next question. Why should we practice tolerance? Tolerance itself, which is talked about a lot in our day, actually requires a foundation. If it is going to be an enduring virtue, it needs a rationale. It needs to stand on something. In our day, quite often, it's claimed that people who say they could believe in absolute truth, that it's that's led to hatred and war, that what we need is the practice of charity without the divisiveness of beliefs. We need the practice of charity and tolerance and acceptance without the divisiveness of beliefs. But here's the thing, a moral and spiritual belief. So where does that belief come from that all people have dignity and tolerance and deserve tolerance? Well, tolerance is built on the claim that every human being has dignity and equal worth. That is an absolute claim that all people have that. And if you undermine it by saying that there's no such thing as a claim to be able to know truth, you end up eroding the very ground on which the practice of tolerance stands. In other words, guys, the cure for arrogance and intolerance, which are horrible sins, and they often infect the church as much or more than any place else, is not that we should embrace uncertainty. The cure is that we embrace humility. You can be right and humble. It is possible. You can be uncertain and arrogant. There was a quote about 100 years ago from a Christian writer called G.K. Chesterton. Maybe you've heard of him. On this precise topic. And here's what he said. He says, what we suffer from today is humility in the wrong place. Modesty has moved from the organ of ambition, that is the will or pride, and has settled upon the organ of conviction, that is the mind or confidence in logic or reason and the ability to know where it was never meant to be. A person was meant to be doubtful about himself but undoubting about the truth. That has been exactly reversed. In our day, now, we're all sure of ourselves. We're all confident in ourselves, but we're not confident and we're unsure that we can know anything. Chesterton said, he goes on to say, which I thought was really funny, he says, we're on the road to producing a race of people too mentally modest to believe in the multiplication table. And in fact, Jesus taught the greatest foundation for both tolerance and love resides in God, in His kingdom. People should be prized because they are loved by God. People should be free because God gave them a free will. God gave them a little kingdom where they are to determine or to exercise dominion. And so all of that brings us now to the narrow gate that we've been looking at this morning, that Jesus is talking about in our text, which is often misunderstood and it's so important, and to which we are called to in this particular series that we're studying. The narrow gate is not narrow-mindedness. The narrow gate is not doctrinal correctness. It's not always being right and have everybody else being wrong. The narrow gate is doing what Jesus said to do. The narrow gate is obeying. And there's another word, and this is another word that's gotten messed up. Obeying creatively, intelligently, joyfully, with relaxed hands and ungritted teeth, guys. Obeying the one who has thoroughly mastered life and death, the one who knows. Obeying Him in all things is the narrow gate. So what's the broad gate? Well, the broad gate, that's okay, is just doing anything else. I hope Linda wasn't trying to throw that at me. The broad gate is just doing anything else. The broad gate is just doing anything else except seeking to obey Him in all things. It's only in the narrow gate that we find freedom. Another time Jesus put it like this, and He says, if you obey my teaching, you are really my disciples, then you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Now those words, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free, are inscribed all over the place. When I was studying in the US, most universities had those words inscribed in their hallways. You will know the truth and the truth will set you free. But they do not often include the prior phrase, if you obey my teaching, then you really are my disciples, and you will know the truth, if you obey. In our day, we generally think freedom is the opposite of having to obey anything. We usually think of freedom as the absence of restrictions, but it's not. My little boy Benji, who's at the back there, has a few goldfish. Benji, how many goldfish do you have at the moment? Or fish in there?
5.
About 5 of them, right? 2 of them are big with big googly eyes. I don't know what even type of fish they are. They're not quite goldfish. But he has these fish in his bedroom. Underneath his bed, he's got one of those beds with the desk underneath. And one day, one fish tried to liberate itself. We couldn't find it anywhere in the tank at all. We looked, we couldn't find it. I lifted out some of the things in there, the ornaments, and we found it weeks later. Does anybody want to guess what happened to that fish? Not a good thing. Okay, you don't want to hear. In order to be free to live, a fish must be restricted to water. It's the fish's nature. Freedom is not the absence of restraint and restriction. Freedom is finding the right restriction. Okay? It's swimming in the moral and spiritual reality of God and His kingdom, for which my little nature and your little nature were made. If you obey the teachings of Jesus, He says, you really are my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free, like water makes a fish free. The issue is that Jesus is pushing relentlessly from here to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. The greatest talk ever given is this question, and Nikki will put it up there: whose disciple will you be? Whose disciple will you be? Most people think in our day, even a lot of people in churches think the church exists to make Christians. And that Christians are people who believe the right things that you have to believe in order for a narrow-minded God to let you into heaven one day. idea, I need to say, has got to get deconstructed. Because Jesus never called anybody to be a Christian. Go and look it up. But He called everybody to be born again and to be His disciple. Prostitutes, tax collectors, Roman centurions, religious leaders, and Samaritan lepers. And disciple was not a confusing or mysterious or even particularly religious term in those days. A disciple is somebody who has committed themselves to be with another person, to learn from them, how to do something. Can I just say, you are somebody's disciple, whether you knew that or not? That is to say, you have learned how to live from somebody. When a little baby is born, they have to learn to talk, how to walk, how to read, and then how to spend your time, and how you will spend your money, and how you will relate to others, and what is worth sacrificing yourself for. We all have to learn this. It's the nature of the human condition. Human beings are the kind of creatures who learn how to live by being disciples. Everybody is somebody's disciple. The first are our parents usually, and then maybe our teachers, and then maybe our peers or some mentors in our lives, or often in our day could be celebrities or an online community. For better or for worse, on purpose or by drifting, for sure, you are somebody's disciple. You are. In turn, the master you become a disciple of will teach you a certain way of life. To be somebody's disciple means to choose to be with them, to learn from them, to how to be like them in some way. And you are somebody's disciple. And now, this is the opportunity that we have. We can evaluate the results of that discipleship in your life and perhaps choose a different master. Perhaps a better master. Perhaps one master above all. When Jesus talks about the narrow way or the broad way, He's just talking about the way life is. It has nothing to do with narrow-mindedness or this kind of brittle, look how right I can be. Life is this way. If you want the freedom to make great music, you'll have to arrange your life around practicing and lessons and scales and study. Jen is playing the ukulele, and I'm sure she spends ages practicing, learning, going for lessons. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yes? If you want the freedom of playing great football like Benji, you must arrange your life around training and drills and coaching and watching other matches on video or something like that online. The narrow way is the way of life through which you receive the power to live the vision. To play a piano or the accordion like our friend Janet there, or to play football or to live like Jesus, the narrow way is simply the way that vision requires you to arrange your life in order to receive the power to do what it is you have the vision for. The broad way is just to do anything else, particularly if it's just doing what you feel like doing or doing what everybody else is doing. Now, when Jesus says that many take the broad road and few take the narrow road, listen to this, guys. This is often confused in the church. He is not predicting how many people will end up in heaven. And for sure, He is not saying that God will be happy if only a few people make it. God is not willing that any should perish. Jesus is simply noting that the broad way is the default mode of life. Generally, people tend to drift through their life by habit or whatever they see going on around them. And so this is the question. Have you become a disciple of Jesus? Have you gone through the narrow gate? That's the decision. It's living the way Jesus would live if He were in your place. your top priority, or if, are you a disciple of something else, of money, of security, of addiction, or your own image? This is so crucial. This is why we're here as a church. And so, for the first few weeks of the new year, this is what this is. It's just a promoting the series that's coming up in the new year. We're going to just focus on exactly what it means to be a disciple. Not New Year's resolutions. What it means to be a disciple. The urgency of Jesus' call takes up the entire end of the Sermon on the Mount. And so what I want to leave you today, that you can practice this next week into the new year, is the promise that if you go through the narrow gate and you walk through the road of obedience to Him, which is the best road, you will not do it alone. Through the Holy Spirit, the presence of Jesus will be available to you every moment. And so I close with this story. I read about a guy called Danny this week. He's one of those people who is apparently not easily satisfied. Therefore, he has the most amazing experiences. He's flown a homemade airplane. He has gone hang gliding. Anybody go hang gliding here before? Janet has done pretty much all of these things. He climbed mountains, hanging onto a rope where he did not know whether the rope was tethered to anything or not. Bit of a crazy chap, isn't he? One time, he went spelunking in a cave, which is cave exploration, and his friend told him that there was an inner chamber with a pool of such great beauty, but you could only get there by a very narrow way. And apparently Danny, being Danny, said, sure, let's do it. I'm in, So they started walking through the narrow way in this cave, and after a while, the ceiling got lower and lower, and Danny had to crouch down to get through. It kept getting lower, and he had to get down on his knees. It kept getting lower, and he had to crawl. And it kept getting lower, he had to get on his stomach. Anybody claustrophobic yet? Eventually, it got so constricted, this cave, imagine this, pitch black, that little tunnel was so constricted, he had to lay flat on his back and exhale and scoot a few inches, then he could take another breath. That was the only way that he could move. Why would Danny do this? I don't know why he did it, but I'll tell you how he did it. He said that the only way that he made it was that he had a friend who knew the way, and that friend kept saying to him, keep listening to me, Danny. Don't think about the dark. Don't think about the cave. Don't think about the fear. Just keep listening to my voice. Just do what I tell you to do. Just keep going, and we will get there. And guess what? They did. Let me say to you that you have a friend. You can. In the cave, in the dark, when you're scared and you can hardly breathe. I know some of you are possibly right there right now. I know it can be difficult, but you're not alone. He is there. This Jesus in the darkness and in the fear, He's whispering to you, don't give up. It'll be okay. I'm with you. This week, when you're thinking about becoming His disciple, listen to His voice when you get up and when you get out of bed and when you go back into bed, when you get to work and when you come home, when you have a problem and when you're filled with joy. This week, get your Bible out and read the words of the Sermon on the Mount and ask, God, would you speak to me, please? Would you speak to me? Anytime you think of it, just practice doing what He said to do. Let's pray.